My family has always had a knack for collections. My mother was kind of a hoarder for porcelain cats. Each one was numbered and named in their own tiny little painted faces, lined up in a neat row on shelves and ran the length of the living room. My father curated shelves of vintage cameras, each meticulously labeled with its make and year. He spent hours in his dark room, polishing lenses and being obsessive with the care and murmuring to himself like a priest before the altar. My older sister cataloged every movie ticket she had ever bought, arranged chronologically and cross-referenced by directors. Even as a teenager, she carried a battered ledger everywhere, making careful notations about runtime, cast, and box office performance. Me? I never had a collection. I hated those obsessions that seemed to define them, even trap them. My mother once missed my school play because she was chasing a rare ceramic kitten 2 towns over. My father often missed dinner, hunched over on a tripod or bent under a red glow in his dark room light. My sister, when she wasn't buried in her ticket stubs, seemed more invested in preserving the past than living in the present. Their collections weren't just hobbies, they were identities, consuming and isolating them. When my mother passed last year, the family house, a sprawling Victorian with gingerbread trim and a wild, overgrown garden, became mine. My dad had died years ago, and my sister had moved overseas, leaving me the sole heir to their legacy. It wasn't just the house, it was the collections. I didn't want the responsibility, but there was no avoiding it. I spent weeks cleaning, sorting, and cataloging. The house felt alive, as though it had been waiting for someone to pay attention to it. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes, it all seemed deliberate, like the house was breathing along with me. The porcelain cats stared down at me from their shelves, their unblinking eyes tracking my every move. My father's camera sat in a neat row, their lenses catching the reflecting and faintest light, giving the impression that they were watching. There was one part of the house that I always avoided: the dining room cabinet. It had always been locked, and as a kid, I assumed that it held some good china, the kind reserved for guests we never had. But as I sifted through the clutter, I found a key taped to the underside of the dining chair. My curiosity got the better of me. The cabinet didn't hold plates. It held jars. Dozens of glass jars, each meticulously labeled in neat, familiar handwriting. My mother's handwriting, the same looping script that adorned every porcelain cat base. Each jar was filled with a fine grayish dust that shimmered faintly when it caught the light. I picked one up at random. The name on the label didn't ring a bell. At first, I assumed that it was just another of my mother's particular collections, a relic of her obsessive tendencies. But something about that jar it unsettled me. I couldn't quite explain it, but the weight of the jar in my hand just felt wrong, as though it were heavier than it really should be and should have been for that size. That night, I dreamt of my mother. She stood in the dining room, her back to me, her hands busy arranging the jars on the table. When I called her name, she turned, but her face was blurred, as though smudged with an eraser. She pointed to the cabinet, and when I awoke, the image of her outstretched hand lingered in my mind like a stain. The next morning, there was a jar on the dining room table. It hadn't been there the night before. I was sure I had locked that cabinet back. I double-checked it, inspected the jars, counted them. Nothing seemed to be out of place. I told myself I must have just missed it during my inventory, but the same thing happened the next night, and then a week later. Each of those mornings, a new jar appeared on the table, each labeled with a name that I didn't recognize. I couldn't shake the feeling that these jars were important. They felt alive in some way, humming faintly in the back of my mind whenever I was near them. Their presence was heavy, oppressive, as though the air around them just thickened. The breaking point came when I started cross-referencing the names with local history. Each name belonged to someone that had gone missing in the area over the past 40 years. My family wasn't just collecting objects. They were collecting people. That night, I decided to confront whatever or whoever was responsible. I set up a chair in the corner of the dining room, armed with nothing but a flashlight and my growing paranoia. The house seemed to hold its breath as the hours just crawled by. The faintest sound, floorboard settling, the hum of the refrigerator, just felt amplified, each one setting my nerves on edge. At 3:15 a.m., the air turned cold. My breath fogged in front of me, the faint smell of acid or smoke and mold wafted through the room. Then, he appeared. The man stepped out from the shadows, impossibly tall, his disintegrating burgundy suit clinging to a skeletal frame. His face was pale, waxy as though it had been sculpted by candle wax and left too close to a flame. His eyes glinted like polished obsidian, bottomless and unreadable. He moved with deliberate grace, placing a jar on the table with a kind of reverence.
"You're not supposed to watch,"
he said, his voice smooth and unhurried, like the creak of a slowly opening door. I gripped the flashlight tighter. Who are you?" He smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes.
"The collector, of course."
"What are you collecting?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He didn't respond. Instead, he pointed to the cabinet.
"Keep them safe,"
he said. Then, he was gone, melting back into the shadows as though he had never been there at all. In the days that followed, I tried to leave. I packed my bags and tried to call my sister, even attempted to list the house online, but every attempt was thwarted. The car wouldn't start. My phone wouldn't dial. Emails failed to send. Local realtors refused to even look at the property. The house had me trapped. The jars kept appearing. The names grew familiar. A neighbor, the clerk from the grocery store, a childhood friend I hadn't seen in years. Each one a silent accusation. A reminder of how small and interconnected my world had become. I wanted to hate those jars, just to smash them and scatter their dust, free the souls they held. But something stopped me. The jars felt sacred, important, as though destroying them would unravel something far greater than I could even comprehend. Then, I found 2 jars, hidden at the very back of the cabinet. 2 jars. My parents' names. The sight of them just shattered something inside me. Their collections, their obsessions. They hadn't been harmless little quirks. They had been symptoms of something darker. Something had consumed them completely. This morning, I found a new jar on the table. It didn't have a name, just a blank label, and a pen right beside it. I think it's my turn. I've always tried to be a good person, and I don't mean just tipping a little extra or buying free-range meat. In every decision I make, in every part of my day, I try to think about how I can help other people around me. I've had 7 rescue dogs and 3 cats. I give away money to charity on a regular basis, and I do volunteer work in the local parks over the weekends. By every metric, I'm a good person. So, why is it then that when I need something in return, everyone looks the other way? Why is asking for a tiny bit of payment every now and again like pulling teeth? Just last week, I looked after an old lady at the end of the road, Miss Hutchinson, while her grandfather was out of town on business for the weekend. You see, her mind has started to go, and it's not safe to leave her by herself. I treated her so well. I cooked for her, took her outside in her chair for a stroll in the park, and I read to her to ease her to sleep. I didn't even charge her or her granddaughter. Well, I didn't charge them money at least. And 3 days ago, when that little boy came up to me with tears in his eyes, sniffling and sobbing because he didn't know where his mama was, I took his hand and marched him right up to the corner for them to call her up. I stayed with the boy, who told me that his name was Tommy, for 45 minutes until his mother came. A horrible, ungrateful woman who yanked little Tommy by the arm and nearly sprinted out of the store. Not so much as even a thank you. That very same day, not an hour after, I walked by a homeless man sitting on the street corner. I made conversation with this man, gave him my jacket, which, by the way, had $40 in his pocket, and took him to get lunch. Not some cheap fast food place, but a real sit-down restaurant. These are just 3 examples of the entire lifetime of good deeds. So, you see, I am a good person. I know I am. It's not like Miss Hutchinson was using her legs anyways. I'm going to get far more use out of them than she'd ever be able to. Not to mention the service I provided. The ungrateful granddaughter didn't even need to ask me to take care of poor Miss Hutchinson. I did it out of the goodness of my heart. And it is my heart. I worked hard to earn it. And that little boy, he has 2 hands after all. If you ask me, that's a small price to pay. That's a small price to pay to ensure his safety in such a dangerous world. The mother should have been bowing in gratitude for the time I sacrificed for her and her son. And almost worst of all was the homeless guy. After all I gave him, he had the audacity to call me a freak, a monster. I'm a saint, but even saints lose their temper. Still, even in my anger, I was fair. I only took half of the jaw. That leaves him $40 richer and a stomach full of good food, which wasn't cheap, by the way, and with still the other half of his jaw to use when he eats. I've just finished putting myself together, and I must say, these new parts fit like a glove. I use the old rotted ones as fertilizer for my garden. I grow my own vegetables, even give them away to my neighbors sometimes. But I sigh when I think of how unfair it all is. I do so much and ask for little in return. Maybe someday someone will finally be able to see how generous I am, how much I give to those around me. Until that day, I'll go on helping people, handing out small blessings to everyone I can. Because that's what good people like me do. Thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. I did not expect that in that second story, but I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you guys did and you guys would like to see more, make sure to like, comment, and if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. Show some love. And make sure to turn on those post notifications, by the way, because that actually does really help me out. So if you don't mind, thank you. But make sure to check out the links in the description, like Twitter, Instagram, everything like that, yada yada, including my Gmail if you want to submit a story. I've got a lot of content, and a lot more. But I would also like to definitely do some of the like subscriber creepypastas if you guys have ever written any. But with that being said, stay safe, stay scary, and I'll see you in the next one.